London is generally regarded as being one of the most history-rich cities on Earth. Since its birth some 2,000 years ago, it has been constantly remodelled and reimagined throughout the ages, and continues to change even into the modern day. In today's documentary, together we will attempt to tackle the incredible history of this beautiful city, and highlight some of the main turning points that paved the way for London's future. Specifically, we will be looking at the origins of London, finding out how and why it first became occupied, and how it grew to be the capital of England. As such, we will be touching upon the Iron Age roots, the Roman settlement, the changes witnessed during the Saxon and Viking periods, the Norman reimagination, and the vast expansion throughout the Middle Ages. So, without further ado, welcome to the origins of London. We begin our story on the banks of the River Thames, with a quick geology lesson to understand the landscape. The area where today's London sits is a shallow valley of chalk which was formed over 90 million years ago. Back then, this entire area was underwater, being the seabed for a shallow and warm ocean which covered most of England. Over an extensive period of time, the earth cooled and the sea levels dropped, and the area subsequently became a large, slow-moving river. The flow of this river deposited sediment on the banks either side, and gradually the river narrowed. During this period, we see the first evidence of human activity along the River Thames, with some rudimentary tools such as hand axes being found buried within these sedimentary banks. These people would have been nomadic hunter-gatherers, moving across the land as they followed herds of animals which they would hunt throughout the seasons. By the Neolithic period, people had started to settle down and adopt an agricultural lifestyle, becoming static for the first time in Britain's history, something which had occurred across Europe and the Middle East for thousands of years already, making Britain very late to the farming party. Indeed, it is believed that Britain was one of the very last countries to be introduced to agriculture and reliable farming techniques. During this time, the area that would become London was incredibly different to what we see today. The landscape was covered in forest either side of the River Thames, and indeed the river was about 4 to 5 times as wide as what it is now. The relatively poor soil meant that agriculture in this area was difficult to maintain, so the only evidence of settlement during this time would have been small farmsteads dotted around the basin, likely somewhat close to the river to make use of the fishing opportunities. And this is how life remained in the Neolithic Thames basin, from around 5000 BC to 200 BC. There is evidence of a Bronze Age bridge built from timber, which may have stretched across a narrow segment of the River Thames near modern-day Vauxhall. It is also theorised that this ancient bridge may have connected the mainland to a small island in the middle of the river instead, as opposed to crossing the entire length of the River Thames. Between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, it is believed that more people began to settle in the Thames basin, creating small villages of timber roundhouses with thatched roofs. Small animal enclosures were set up around these hamlets, and earth ditches began to be dug in an attempt to fortify the land against neighbouring tribes, who were also growing in number. One of these defensive structures was Grim's Dyke, a name given much later as Grim refers to the pagan god Woden. The earthworks of Grim's Dyke stretched across modern-day Harrow, likely built by the cathedral tribe who resided in this area north of London at the time. It is not clear why this earthwork was built, but it is understood that southeastern Britain was becoming under attack by invading Gallic tribes of modern-day France. These people were considerably more advanced than the farming settlers of Britain, equipped with chariots, slingers, and a semi-organised militia. The Catevallauni tribe dominated the areas of modern-day Middlesex, Hertfordshire, and Bedfordshire, working in relative peace with the neighbouring tribes such as the Trinovantes of southern East Anglia and Cambridgeshire, and the Iceni of Norfolk. As such, it was paramount that the Britannic tribes defended themselves against these Gallic invaders. The Iron Age tribes therefore began building hill forts to defend themselves, large circular earthworks complete with palisade walls, gatehouses, and multiple rows of banks to slow down attackers. It is during this time that we see multiple hill forts appear all around the Thames Basin. Horsenden Hill, Lufton Camp, Shooter's Hill, Uphull Camp, Hallwood Camp, Langdon Hills, and Southweald Camp, just to name a few, even including a hill fort directly underneath the modern-day Woolwich Power Station in central London. This is the first time that the Thames Basin had become fortified in preparation against a foreign enemy. If only the Iron Age people knew what the following 100 years was going to bring upon their shores. The Romans first landed on the shores of South England in 55 BC, with the military expedition of Julius Caesar. However, it wasn't until 43 AD when the Roman Empire decided to leave their permanent mark on British history. The giant conquest oversaw by Emperor Claudius began in southern England, and quickly ventured north, capturing the Catalavorni capital of Colchester, or Camulodunum, although it was only named as such following the Roman occupation. Camulodunum became the capital of Roman England, and a foothold as the legions began to stretch out in all directions, conquering the English heartlands, southern Wales and East Anglia, and marching all the way north to Scotland before the 1st century AD was through. During this time, there was still no major settlement to speak of on the Thames Basin, likely just a cluster of small fishing ports and docklands. These soon came under Roman rule, as the military required the ports to ferry troops and supplies from one side of the River Thames to the other. Indeed, this is how Roman London was born. The Iron Age fishing port quickly grew in size to a fully fledged Roman ferrying port. Almost immediately after the Roman reconfiguration of this dockland, the military commanders deemed it necessary to build a bridge spanning across the river. A wide pontoon bridge was made of timber, and this connected the two ferry ports together. The large-scale construction project to build this bridge saw many workmen's houses springing up on each side of the river, particularly on the northern side. As the bridge soon became a popular transport link, more and more people began to settle in and around the harbour area. And soon, streets filled with market stalls and buildings on either side, temples and administration centres were all helping to put this dockland area on the map. The settlement was named Londinium, which was the first official name given to this area on the bank of the River Thames. By 60 AD, Camulodunum had grown to be a fully fleshed out Roman city, complete with bathhouses, a forum, basilica and mosaic floors. Londinium was also quickly catching up, bloating in size as the settlement continued to rapidly expand. In 61 AD, tensions between the new Roman occupiers and the Iceni tribe in East Anglia began to boil over, with the Iceni Queen Boudica leading a revolt against the Romans. The Iceni allied with other various tribes such as the Trinovantes and the Catalavornis, and their uprising quickly snowballed as they marched down south to Camulodunum, and burnt the city to the ground. This was a symbol of great defiance and insult to the Roman rulers, as Camulodunum was a city originally built for the retired veterans, as well as serving as a poster child of what luxuries and sophistication a Roman way of life could provide. The city was pillaged and the citizens were slaughtered. The Roman capital was left to burn in a fiery inferno which left scorch marks in the earth that can still be seen today some 2,000 years later. After the sacking of Camulodunum, the rebellion marched towards Londinium, hearing word that the military grain storage had been held within the city. Londinium bore the same fate as its neighbour, with its streets being fed to the flames. Following further ransackings of various other major settlements around Roman Britain, the rebellion was eventually crushed, with Boudica making a fatal mistake in agreeing to open field combat with the Roman army. This misstep in judgment saw the Iceni rebels massacred on a monumental scale by the Roman war machine, with some modern historians estimating that around 50,000 Britons were killed in a single day. This was the Battle of Watling Street, steeped in legend due to the lack of contemporary evidence. But the victory clearly sent tremors throughout the surviving British tribes, as warlord after warlord soon came forward to pledge their allegiance to the Roman Emperor, bending the knee to ensure the safety of their people. After this tumultuous time had passed, Londinium was soon rebuilt, and greatly expanded in size. By 80 AD, a large forum, basilica and governor's palace had been built, placed in the middle of the city where the two main roads crossed. Also, this is the time where we can explore our first surviving piece of history from this time period. Hidden under the courtyard of the medieval Guildhall of London lays the remains of one of the biggest construction projects ever built in Roman London. These are the ruins of Londinium's amphitheatre. The first amphitheatre was constructed in around 70 AD. This was made of timber and lasted for around half a century until it was later rebuilt on a much grander scale, and also made of stone instead. The finished building would have looked very similar to the Colosseum of Rome, but on a smaller scale. However, it could still hold an audience of around 6,000 people. This was a considerable amount, since Londinium's entire population during this time was likely between 20 to 30,000. Gladiatorial fights would have been a spectacle for all to watch and enjoy, having fulfilled the role of modern games today. Likewise, the Forum played the role of the market square. The open area would be filled with market stalls, and the buildings around the sides were shops and office spaces where things like taxes and logistics were worked out, with the main administration centre being the adjoining basilica. In 122 AD, Emperor Hadrian visits Londinium, and soon after, in 140 AD, the population had exploded to 50,000 people. The city now had a functional sewage drainage system, as well as piped water. The administrators of Londinium decided that a protective wall was required to defend the city from any future uprising. When the Iceni rebels arrived at Londinium in 61 AD, there were only earth banks and ditches protecting the settlement, which made attacking the city very easy. So, between 190 to 225 AD, large stone walls were built which defended the east, west and north of Londinium, with the Thames River acting as a natural barrier to the south. Some of these Roman walls can still be seen today. However, it should be said that these have been heavily adapted throughout the centuries, and most of what you see date from between the 1300s to the 1800s. In the Barbican estate, we see a portion of the wall which has survived miraculously well. Again, much of what survives are from later periods in history, but we do know that a Roman military fortress once stood on this site, only a stone's throw away from the amphitheatre. By 197 AD, Londinium becomes effectively twinned with York, as both cities become the administrative centres for Roman Britain. In the mid-3rd century, a temple was built by the shore of the River Thames in the heart of Londinium. This temple can still be seen today, as it lies underneath a Bloomberg building and is available to view, hidden underground. This is the Mithraeum, a Roman temple dedicated to Mithras, a bull-fighting deity. Mithras acquired a cult-like following, especially favoured by Roman soldiers, and the Mithraeum here in Londinium was also said to have become one of the earliest surviving Christian churches, if not the earliest, in all of Britain. Curiously, the entire temple has actually been moved. It was discovered in 1954 during excavation work for the construction of a new office block, and subsequently moved stone by stone and rebuilt 100 metres away at Temple Court, which was then displayed at the modern street level. After the Bloomberg Company bought the original site in 2010, they agreed to move the Mithraeum back to its original location, building a custom subterranean museum to display the various artefacts which were found during the original excavation. In 286 AD, military admiral Carausius attempts to claim Britain for himself and declares himself as leader of the Britannic Empire. This declaration was quickly met with harsh condemnation from Rome, who charges him with corruption and treason. 7 years later, Carausius is slain by Electus, who then takes control of the Roman British Empire himself, further solidifying Romano Britain as a breakaway province from the Roman Empire. Rome is then forced to send in the military as civil war breaks out, with fighting between two Roman armies causing great unrest and fear amongst the Romano-British population. The rebellion ends in 296 AD with the death of Electus, but the cracks have already been seen, and the northern border of Romano-Britain comes under attack by Celtic tribes. Hadrian's Wall and several Roman border forts such as Segedunum are attacked, and the Roman military becomes considerably strained, being forced to abandon several positions along the northern territories. With all this infighting and threats from outsider tribes breaking their way into Roman lands, many large construction projects in Londinium cease to continue, and buildings like the Forum, Basilica and the Amphitheatre become neglected and soon dilapidated. By the beginning of the 5th century, Romano-Britain begins to fall apart from within, now being officially cut off from the mainland empire, which has now become cannibalized with infighting, corruption, and all-out civil war between the east and the west. Over the next 5 decades, droves of Saxon, Angles and Jute marauders acted as a final nail in the coffin for Romano-Britain. A mass migration was met with little pushback as the Roman military garrison in Britain had effectively destroyed itself from civil war. Several shore forts dotted along the coastlines of East Anglia and southeastern England attempted to stop the boats from coming over, but they could do little to combat the mainland European settlers who flocked to Britain to make a new home for themselves. Some Saxons, Jutes and Angles were aggressive, with raiding parties pillaging several Roman settlements across the southern coasts, but the majority of migrants were peaceful and just wanted to start over a new life as mainland Europe was going through a turmoil of Roman civil war. So, the Roman period in Britain lasted for roughly 400 years, and ended in chaos as the fall of the greatest empire on earth turned everything on its head, plunging the remaining Romano-British into uncertainty for their future. But the sands of time continue to filter through the hourglass, and life presses on. Londinium has a new occupier, the Saxons. The issue of talking about the Saxon history of London is that, for the majority of the Saxon period, they didn't live there. By the time of the mass migration of the 5th century AD, Londinium had already been mostly a decaying ruin for the best part of 100 years. Throughout the previous century, more and more skilled workers like tile makers, plumbers, builders and carpenters were leaving Britain to find work elsewhere in mainland Europe. As such, there were fewer people to maintain the Roman buildings, and by the fall of the Roman Empire, the economy collapsed, coins stopped being minted and the government fell through, meaning that you couldn't even pay the workers to maintain your forums, roads and houses even if you wanted to. So why didn't the Saxons rebuild and repopulate Londinium when they arrived? Again, one of the main problems is the lack of skilled workers. That isn't to say that the Saxons as a nation were not clever, after all they were prominent boat builders. But they were used to constructing timber houses and long halls, not the stone multi-storey apartment buildings and bathhouses with tiled roofs and fancy plumbing that Roman Londinium was filled with. Instead, the Saxons saw Londinium as one giant quarry, stripping the streets of its stone and timber to build settlements and boundary walls for their fields on the outskirts of the city, where they could farm just like how they were used to. One of the other major issues with the Roman city was the harbour. The Romans used large ships called briremes, triremes and quinteremes, which required hundreds of men to row, also requiring mooring platforms and a series of winches and cranes to load and offload goods from the ship. The Saxons, while expert shipbuilders, had very small boats in comparison, and just needed a beach to pull the boats ashore. So, as much of an incredible feat of engineering that the Roman harbour of Londinium was, it proved to be fairly useless to the new Saxon settlers, who instead favoured the sandy beaches either side of Londinium at Greenwich and Fulham. On a further note, a Roman city heavily depended on a population of around 20 to 50,000 people who worked within the local economy to bring in taxes required for the upkeep of the city. This also relied on a much bigger economy in the background that could fund large-scale industry such as tile-making or steelworks. Since these Saxon settlers did not have large populations, pre-existing economies or large industries, there would have been no reality where Londinium could ever continue to function under Saxon rule. From the 5th to the 8th centuries AD, the Saxons continued using the ruins of Londinium as a quarry to get building supplies for their own smaller settlements. Around this time, we do see several Saxon communities spring up ever closer to the original Roman settlement, such as Islington and Paddington, but it appears that Londinium itself still remains left to ruin. It is not until the end of the 8th century where we first see Londinium being populated, being in the far southeastern corner of the Mercian kingdom. At this time, Britain was divided into several Saxon kingdoms, such as Mercia, Wessex and Sussex. And these were then split down into smaller local kingdoms, which meant that war between neighbouring kingdoms was all too common, considerably halting the ability for these towns to progress and expand. The ex-Roman town of Winchester appears to have become the main focus of Saxon Britain, becoming the new regional capital, and Londinium just remained as a fairly unimportant border town, being reoccupied by various warring factions. This is, however, when we get to a new name for London, as confirmed on stamped coins which were now being minted and circulated by the Saxons from the 7th century onwards. Londinium was now known as Lundenwic, with other temporary names being attributed to the settlement such as Londiniu, Londinus, and Londinia. Gradually, Lundenwic began to get remodelled into a town fit for the Saxon way of life, with the streets seemingly following the same Roman grid pattern. A typical Saxon trading technique was to beach their merchant boats and sell their goods directly off the boat. It seems that, over time, these traders began hauling their boats further up the shore and used buildings to show off their wares instead. These were the first Saxon merchant halls, and settlements usually sprang up around these halls, as they often became the centre of society. Trade routes with other growing towns were then established, linking Lundenwic with places like Hamwic, which then became Southampton, Norwich and Ipswich, as well as overseas places such as Holland and even Germany. Wool and cloth were the two main imports, and were fashioned into clothing in England. This growing economy saw Lundenwic revisit its old heights, with the population booming to some 5,000 people by the mid-8th century. By the beginning of the 9th century, Saxon Lundenwic expanded further than the original Roman layout, now reaching as far west as modern-day Trafalgar Square, although it should be said that the population was still considerably lower than Londinium during the height of the Roman period. One interesting point to note is that this newly growing town required multiple churches to tend to its ever-increasing population. Two of the churches in question was a chapel at St. Paul and another chapel at Forney, now known as modern-day Westminster. The prosperity of Lundenwic was always on shaky grounds. Unlike with the Romans, the Saxons never had a safety net like the Empire to provide security and allow for progression and growth. The kingdoms were at war with each other for almost the entirety of the Saxon period, and at the end of the 8th century, things got a lot harder. In 793 AD, Viking longships turned up along the shores of the Holy Island in Northumberland, and a raiding party proceeded to pillage and burn down the monastery at Lindisfarne. The Saxons had always assumed that they were fairly safe in this part of the world, as the King of Northumbria had a tight grip on his kingdom. The raid at Lindisfarne sent shockwaves throughout Saxon England, and over the following 200 years, more and more Nordic raiders would set sail for England and wreak havoc on every Saxon kingdom. Lindisfarne was not the first Viking raid in England, but it was certainly the first to prompt a serious response from the Saxon kings, who now began to work together to raise a coastal army to prepare for future raids. Initially, the Vikings continued to plague only the northern territories of England, but soon enough they began to travel south, circumnavigating the entirety of England and hitting places like Kent, East Anglia, and even travelling up rivers to attack places inland. In 842 AD, the Norse followed the Thames estuary upstream until they reached Londonwick. Then they beached their ships and attacked the Saxon settlement, which still had its Roman town walls, but they were heavily dilapidated by this time and were falling apart. The first raid on Londonwick was described by later medieval chroniclers as the Great Slaughter. And indeed it must have been a horrific time for the citizens of Londonwick who thought they would be safe. The Saxons soon learned that nowhere was safe, and only 9 years later, a second Viking raid on Londonwick brought further devastation to the town. 350 ships sailed around the southeastern coast of England, each boat filled with bloodthirsty warriors, armed to the teeth with axe and spear. By this time, the town of Londonwick was believed to be situated just west of the Roman town layout, near where Strand is today. Again, the Vikings butchered the local population and were met with little pushback, as the Saxon military were already stretched to the breaking point as so many Nordic raids were happening in every corner of every Saxon kingdom. By 865 AD, the Vikings had sent another wave of Nordic raiders over to England, but this time it was different. A giant swathe of warriors known as the Great Heathen Army disembarked on England's coasts, each man heavily armed, with many wearing mail shirts, helmets, shields and spears. These were well-trained and ruthless killers, ordered to put an end to the Saxon kingdoms once and for all. The terror that the Great Heathen Army caused led to Londonwick being abandoned as the violence became too much. Under the reign of King Alfred, the townsfolk moved back into the old Roman town, and were told to bolster up the pre-existing Roman town walls. The Saxon people rebuilt the walls and the towers, and redug the earth ditches and ramparts outside of the walls. This turned Londonwick into a fortified settlement, giving it a new name, Londonburg. Throughout most of the Saxon period, it is believed that the original Roman bridge had become derelict and collapsed, leaving Saxon Londonburg without a bridge to cross over to Suffolk on the southern bank of the River Thames. There was a settlement at Suffolk, born from the Roman era, so Alfred ordered this area to also be fortified with walls and ramparts. King Alfred proved to be one of the most successful Saxon leaders, successfully pushing the Vikings out of his kingdom of Wessex, the last remaining kingdom yet to bend the knee to the Nordic invaders. Moving forward 100 years, and Londonburg was again attacked by marauding Vikings. This time it appears that the town was well fortified and prepared, being able to fend off the Norse for over 20 years of near-constant siege. In 1016, the Danish king Canute became the first king of England, finally confirming Viking ownership over the country after over 200 years of conflict. Records at the time confirmed that he taxed the kingdom £72,000 of silver, with Londonburg receiving a bill of £10,500 on its own. This suggests that Londonburg was by far the largest and wealthiest town in England by this time. It appears that Canute was considerably favourable with the Saxons, seemingly dedicating most of his time to developing Christian churches and focusing on trade and diplomacy rather than brutal warfare. It is also believed that he may have built a timber bridge over the River Thames to reconnect the two settlements of Londonburg and Suffolk. One of the monastic sites he favoured in particular was Westminster, where he had set up his political seat and also redeveloped Westminster Abbey. Canute's son and heir, Harold Harefoot, was also the first English king to be buried at Westminster Abbey. Now that, for the most part, England had finally fell under Nordic rule, this opened Londonburg up to the vast Viking trade routes that had been established for hundreds of years, expanding to the far reaches of the known Earth, including Greenland, Iceland, Russia, Iran, and even India. Londonburg was beginning to prosper once again, and throughout all of its struggles and hardships, had become one of the most prominent cities in all of England. Following the death of King Harthacnut in 1042, the Viking grip over England suddenly slipped, as the Saxon king Edward the Confessor replaced him on the throne. Edward was the ruler of Wessex, the final Saxon kingdom. He used this opportunity to re-establish Saxon rule in England. He was highly favoured by the people of England after all, which greatly helped him concrete his power. Edward the Confessor oversaw the great remodelling of Westminster Abbey, also having his royal palace on the grounds of the church. The Westminster Abbey that you see today is much later medieval architecture, but the general layout was designed by the Saxon king and his team of architects. Edward the Confessor died on the 5th of January 1066, and was buried at the newly developed Westminster Abbey the following day. He had entrusted Harold Godwinson with the Kingdom of England, as he was already the sub-ruler of the Kingdom of Wessex. Godwinson immediately set to work on vanquishing the Vikings from England once and for all. On the 25th of September 1066, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada met Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Following a violent few hours of combat, Hardrada was slain, as well as the turncoat brother of Harold Godwinson, Tostig. The victory of Stamford Bridge was short-lived, as there was another much larger threat now disembarking on the South English coast. Harold's army marches south to meet the Norman forces who have just disembarked at Pevensey, South England. William the Conqueror, commander of the Normans, leads his men north through the countryside towards an area which will later be aptly named Battle. The Saxons form a shield wall along an earth bank, giving them the high ground advantage. Meanwhile, the Norman army organises themselves at the bottom of the field, armed with thousands of soldiers as well as mounted knights. The first time mounted knights have been used in an English battle. The Saxons are certainly wary, bruised from their recent battle at Stamford Bridge and the hurried march down south, but certainly battle-hardened and eager. The Normans advance, marching up the hill as a sea of knights and spearmen move towards the Saxon shield wall. Heavy fighting ensued, but the Saxons managed to push them back, refusing to break ranks. The Normans attempt a cavalry charge, yet cannot find a way to break through the tightly organised wall of shields that the Saxons have built. The Saxons, now gaining confidence in their abilities, begin to goad the Normans as they retreat down the hill, brandishing their sharp Dane axes which are now dripping in Norman blood. The Norman infantry advance once more, trying to force their way through the Saxon shield wall, but once again they are repelled. During another cavalry charge, William the Conqueror suddenly disappears, and whispers resonate through the lines on both sides that he may have been slain. The Duke of Normandy quickly gets back on his horse, removing his helmet as he speeds in front of his own army, reassuring them that he is still alive and well. A third cavalry charge is attempted, but again is deflected. However, this time something happens which neither the Normans or the Saxon king had anticipated. As the Norman cavalry retreat once more, several Saxons break ranks and attempt to charge down the fleeing invaders, leaving a hole in their shield wall. William instantly pounces on this opportunity, rallying his men to suddenly turn round and re-engage the Saxons, taking them off guard and slaughtering them where they stand. Immediately, the Duke of Normandy then orders his archers to open fire, raining hellfire down on the opened-up Saxon ranks. Failure turns to chaos, as the Saxons begin to get cut down in droves. The Norman infantry charge once more, this time puncturing a hole through the weakened Saxons who are now in disarray. Blood-curdled screams and war cries fill the air as the Normans proceed to butcher the Saxons on the hill. The cavalry constantly circles round the surviving Saxon warriors, thrusting spears into the islands of men who continue to stand defiantly against the Norman invaders. An arrow falls from the sky and hits Harold Godwinson, striking him in the eye. His Huskars pull him back to safety, but the Norman knights immediately shove their way through, cutting down the Saxon Huskars before slaughtering Harold, who is unable to fight back. This heinous act, carried out by William the Conqueror's personal bodyguard in the heat of the moment, angers and embarrasses the Duke enormously. The Normans followed the standards of chivalry, and cutting down a king who is injured and unable to fight back is the lowest of the low. As such, the Duke of Normandy attempts to tear this page out of the history books, hoping that nobody will remember the terrible act that occurred on this day during the chaos of Red Mist. It won't be until the 12th century where this story will again be told, confirmed in written form by William of Malmesbury. The Norman invaders claimed victory at the Battle of Hastings, which took place on the 15th of October 1066, and later that year on Christmas Day, William, Duke of Normandy, was proclaimed King of England at Westminster Abbey. The age of the Saxons was over. The time of the Normans had begun. So, what did this mean for Lundenburg? Well, firstly, the name changed. While the town saw many alternative spellings and pronunciations throughout its history, this is when we first see the name London being used to describe the settlement. The Normans immediately began bolstering up the defences of London, turning London into a fiercely fortified town. They built not one but two castles in the town, the famous Tower of London, and another which not many people know about. Baynard's Castle used to stand on the shore near Blackfriars. It was built by a Norman lord named Ralph Baynard, and protected the western side of London while the Tower of London protected the east side. However, textual evidence suggests that a fortification was here during the Saxon period, using the pre-existing Roman walls. The castle survived for around 130 years before being demolished by King John during the Barons' Revolt. It is believed to have been rebuilt following this conflict, but was later sold to the Blackfriars monastic estate. The monastery turned the castle into a mansion and traded its military use for a more domestic lifestyle instead. By the latter part of the castle's life, it likely looked similar to Newark Castle in Nottinghamshire, with large ornate windows looking out on the River Thames, and big towers creating a very imposing sight. The castle was used as a royal estate, until it was seriously damaged in the Great Fire of London in 1666, and was subsequently left to ruin, with remnants surviving until the 19th century. But the main castle is, of course, the Tower of London. Immediately after the Normans arrived in London, they began rebuilding and improving the Roman and Saxon fortifications. They built a large timber motte and bailey castle on the eastern side of London where the Roman walls reached the shore. A motte and bailey castle is a typical early Norman type of fortress, where you have a series of earth ditches, sometimes filled with water, called a motte or moat. Then a raised area of ground called a bailey where the buildings are kept, protected by a palisade wall. Then a large mound would be constructed, usually at the back of the bailey, and a tall wooden tower called a keep or a donjon would be built on top, both acting as a lookout spot as well as a lord's personal chambers. Soon after this castle was erected, it was reconstructed in stone, greatly improving its defensive capabilities. In the 1070s, the famous Square Keep was built and was likely the tallest structure in London until the several cathedrals were built in the following century. The keep also served as the royal palace of William the Conqueror. The castle at London also featured a formidable curtain wall, complete with a series of towers and gatehouses. The majority of this curtain wall was built in the early 13th century by King Henry III, likely replacing the previous timber palisade. Henry III also opted to paint the castle white, giving it the name the White Tower. What most people don't know is that the majority of castles were painted during the Middle Ages, and rarely were they left with stone facing being exposed. Whitewashing castles made them shine and be seen for miles around, showing off the grandeur and riches of the upper classes. Back in the medieval period, showing your wealth meant everything. People loved colour, so brightly coloured clothing and buildings were all the rage. Every surface would be patterned, dyed or painted, from leather belts and pouches to walls and furniture, a far cry from the dismal pictures that Hollywood will try to show you. King Edward I then further fortified the castle, as he was handling many conflicts around England at the time, such as the conquest into Wales, the War of Scottish Independence, and the constant on and off again wars with France. King Edward III also spent considerable sums of money in fortifying the castle, improving the security and bolstering up the defences, as the conflict which would later be known as the 100 Years' War with France was now heating up. Edward III was also noted for another construction project within London, this time a little outside the walls in an area which would have been countryside. In what is now known as Bermondsey, a small ruin can be seen in a patch of grass. While it may not look like much today, these are the foundationary remains of one of King Edward III's royal palaces. In its heyday, it was a square mansion consisting of 4 wings and an inner courtyard, contained within a moat with a gatehouse and drawbridge for access. Understandably, it is difficult to imagine such a building, but luckily we have a surviving example not far away which would have looked quite similar. This is Ightham Moat in Sevenoaks. It is a 14th century manor house which was built around the same time as Edward III's manor, and also shares a very similar blueprint. The foundations and some of the buildings would have been made of stone, with various timber-clad rooms building up the 4 wings of the manor. The mansion features high-pointed tile roofs and several chimneys to cater for the multiple grand fireplaces in each room. King Edward III likely used the manor house here in Bermondsey as a peaceful safe haven to practice his main hobby, falconry, a sport specifically reserved for the upper classes. There would have been several mansions, manor houses and palaces dotted around London during the medieval period, owned by members of the royal family, noble lords, as well as prosperous merchants and administrators. Winchester Palace in its heyday would have likely been one of the most splendourous and opulent of them all. Located on the southern bank of the River Thames, the ruins you see here are a tiny remnant of what was once a giant palace, reserved for none other than the Bishop of Winchester. The surviving ruins are from the Great Hall, which, back in the medieval period, would have stood directly against the bank of the River Thames. The incredible rose window would have been adorned in stained glass, and provided multicolour light to nobles and guests who dined in the hall. At the bottom we see the vaulted cellar where supplies were stored. This room also featured a passageway to the river so that boats could unload goods directly to the cellars. It is documented that by the 15th century, the bishops of Winchester and their lavish guests enjoyed quite a luxurious lifestyle, with the palace housing a tennis court, various exotic gardens, and even a bowling alley. Of course, fancy manor houses and formidable castles weren't the only major construction projects that built up London's medieval skyline. Much like France, Britain became a monastic powerhouse throughout the Middle Ages. The use of religion to build industry and create both soft and hard power proved to be a valuable asset and something that the Normans invested into heavily. As the Normans claimed lands from the Saxons in the late 1060s, they immediately built castles and monasteries in every new territory, as many as they could. The Saxons already had many churches throughout England, themselves being devout Christians, but the Normans sought to build grand cathedrals and abbeys as well as parish churches. London became a religious centre for various monastic orders, such as the Carthusians, Cluniacs and Cistercians, just to name a few. To help more easily understand it, there were 3 main monastic houses, and were identifiable by the colour of robes that they wore. The Benedictines, who were known as the Black Friars, the Franciscans, who were the Grey Friars, and the Carmelites, who were the White Friars. So, for example, when you see a street named something like Greyfriars Road, you can assume that there used to be some kind of religious building dedicated to the Franciscans there once upon a time. Westminster was a somewhat rare example of a Saxon abbey that already stood high on London's skyline before the Normans arrived. In 1103, King Edward the Confessor's tomb was opened by King Henry I, who discovered that his dead body was still in remarkable condition. Edward the Confessor was later canonised as a saint in 1161. It is around this time that Westminster became closely associated with the kings of England, with the Royal Palace of Westminster being built right next to the Abbey. This elevated the status of Westminster Abbey considerably, allowing it to gain ownership over the areas around southern England, including multiple London parishes. During the Middle Ages, Westminster was its own separate town, being granted exemption from the Bishop of London's jurisdiction in 1222. This saw the settlement at Westminster grow rapidly throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, threatening to rival London as a major city. King Henry III began an extremely extravagant reconstruction of Westminster Abbey, turning it from the previous Romanesque church of the Norman period to the grand Gothic cathedral that you see today with its high-pointed arches and extended nave. It is during this reconstruction when the central platform was installed, which is a shrine purpose-built to house Edward the Confessor's tomb, who continues to be the centrepiece of the church to this very day. His tomb is surrounded by various other kings of England, including Henry III, Edward III, Richard II, and Edward I, who is buried in a simple 13th century arrow box, the type of box for the storage of arrows taken on military campaigns during his life as a military commander. As ornate as King Edward the Confessor's tomb is, photography atop the royal platform is not allowed. However, you can request a private prayer with a minster in the presence of Confessor's tomb. Another very notable tomb on the royal platform is none other than that of King Henry V. Henry V was a legendary king during the 100 Years' War, who masterminded the Harfleur campaign which witnessed the Battle of Agincourt on the 25th of October 1415. The English victory over the French would forever be remembered as a day of great English patriotism, although there is so much more that happened at the Battle of Agincourt that not many people know about. Shortly after the end of the War of the Roses at the end of the 15th century, the victorious King Henry VII ordered the demolition of the 13th century Lady Chapel, and this is when the immeasurably opulent perpendicular Gothic-style chapel was built, with its ornate vaulted ceiling that remains today as one of the grandest marvels of monastic architecture in all of England. King Henry VII was also buried at Westminster Abbey following his death in 1509, and his lavish tomb sits in the middle of the Lady Chapel, which became unofficially known henceforth as King Henry VII's Chapel. The abbey would then go on to house many more deceased kings and queens of England throughout the centuries that followed. Westminster isn't the only major church in medieval London, as over the river on the south bank, a second cathedral was erected shortly after the Normans took over the city. In the adjoining town of Suffolk, before the three towns of Suffolk, London and Westminster all became integrated with each other, there was a second Saxon church. Originally, a special church named a minster stood on this site, as confirmed in the Domesday Book of 1086 as a pre-existing monastic complex, with some evidence suggesting that a religious covenant stood on this site from as early as the beginning of the 7th century. A minster is essentially a Saxon version of a cathedral, often the most important and largest church in the area where a collection of monks would have lived a communal life, often given a royal charter to carry out their religious practices. After the Normans took over control of England and, by default, the industry of religion, minsters fell out of use, being replaced with friaries, abbeys and cathedrals instead, although a few minsters have continued to remain in use, most notably at Southwell in Nottinghamshire and York Minster in Yorkshire. None other than Bishop Odo of Bayeux, William the Conqueror's half-brother and fellow companion at the Battle of Hastings, took over ownership of the Saxon minster at Suffolk and turned it into a grand Romanesque church. It was later re-established as an Augustinian priory in 1106 during the reign of King Henry I, and from this moment on it became tied with the bishops of Winchester, with the previously mentioned Winchester Palace being constructed right next to the church. A priory was a type of church which was home to a prior. During the medieval period, you had a hierarchy of different types of churches and the heads who were placed in control of them. Generally, from lower ranking to higher ranking, the ladder of hierarchy goes like this. The parish church, where a priest or vicar is given the task in providing religious support to a hamlet, small church or town. A friary, which is a religious building that featured a church within its precinct, but mainly functioned as a hospital or homeless shelter, or a hospice to attend to either elderly monks or monks who had fallen sick. As such, friaries were often situated inside towns and cities, and were very involved with the local community. In fact, in almost every major settlement in England, there would have been at least one white friars, grey friars, and black friars. An abbey is usually a large religious complex away from a civilian settlement, favouring the peace and tranquility of the countryside lifestyle. Abbeys would almost always be built next to large rivers, as they relied on the flow of water to provide power to their watermills. Abbeys would also consist of a collection of monks who lived a self-sufficient life, tending to farms, writing books, designing artwork, and making their own food to sustain themselves and their religious practices. Abbeys would be controlled by an abbot, who was of similar importance to a bishop. Abbeys and priories were fairly interchangeable during the Middle Ages, and fulfilled similar roles. Some abbeys were much larger and more powerful than priories, or vice versa. Then finally, cathedrals were the height of monastic hierarchy. This is where the bishop would reside, one of the highest ranking officials of the church, who would often have a direct line of communication with the Pope. In 1212 AD, a fire caused large-scale devastation in London and damaged the church at Suffolk. However, not long after, the church was rebuilt in the new Gothic fashion, similar to the style of the newly redeveloped Westminster Abbey. Despite being immortalised as a cathedral, Suffolk Priory Church was only somewhat recently granted cathedral status in 1905. There are multiple other notable grand churches which stood tall in medieval London. One of the most famous ones is of course St Paul's Cathedral, but the cathedral that you see today is of a rather modern style, being completely rebuilt in the late 17th to early 18th century following the Great Fire of London in 1666. The original Gothic cathedral which stood on this site during the medieval period was arguably much more ornate than what we see today, with rows upon rows of flying buttresses and a tall spire which stood around 150 metres in the air, making it one of the tallest cathedral spires in all of Europe. The original medieval St Paul's Cathedral also featured multiple monastic gatehouses which gained access to the cathedral precinct, with one of the largest gatehouses standing where the National Firefighters Memorial stands today. Being a religious centre, London was also home to many religious military orders as well. Temple Church, just off Fleet Street, was the London headquarters of the Knights Templar, a religious order which grew to prominence during the Crusades of the late 11th and 12th centuries. The original site would have been much larger than it is today, with the church being surrounded by military training grounds, dormitories to house the knights, as well as both monastic and recreational buildings to occupy the soldiers who lived and trained here. There are multiple knights' effigies inside the church, dedicated to various military leaders who had ties with the Knights Templar, with one of the main tombs being the final resting place of none other than Sir William Marshall. A statue outside the church pays homage to the Knights Templar, which features a horse being ridden by two knights in rags, holding up a torn banner, which is a tip of the hat to the order's pledge of poverty. The irony is that the Knights Templar became incredibly rich from the Crusades, looting and pillaging cities and trade routes in the Middle East, which led to widespread corruption and inevitably marked their downfall as a knightly order. Just down the road from Temple Church is another surviving remnant of a separate monastic order of knights. This is St John's Gatehouse, which was the main entrance to the Church of the Knights of St John, also known as the Knights Hospitaller. The Knights Hospitaller were similar to the Templars, gaining notoriety during the Crusades, and they also had their English headquarters here in London. The church and monastic grounds is now all long gone, and the gatehouse was rebuilt in the early 16th century, but it still shines a light to all the different walks of people who lived in London throughout the Middle Ages. So we can now picture medieval London at its prime. The fortifications, the cathedral towers standing tall above the medieval houses, many of which would have had their own gardens and allotments. But there is still one thing missing: the bridge. Of course, we still have the timber bridge built in the 11th century, and the Normans likely bolstered this up and improved it when they heavily invested into London. But the famous London Bridge came about following a tragic event in the late 12th century. In 1170, as a result of a fallout between Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and King Henry II, a group of knights set upon Becket and murdered him. The reason for this isn't exactly known for sure, as it is believed to have resulted from a miscommunication between the king and his knights. But Henry II clearly showed great regret for his actions, mourning the loss of his friend. In 1176, he ordered the construction of a new bridge in honour of Thomas Becket. This was to be a wide bridge made of stone, with many archers holding it up and allowing the river to flow underneath. There were multi-storey townhouses built on either side of the bridge, overhanging off the edge, complete with market stalls and shops on the bottom floor. Multiple gatehouses protected either side of the bridge, making it considerably fortified. And in the centre stood a tall chapel dedicated to Thomas Becket himself. London Bridge was arguably one of the most ambitious medieval construction projects ever completed. And despite what your pre-assumptions may be about medieval construction, the bridge reportedly only partially collapsed twice during the entirety of the medieval period. And neither of these collapses seem to have caused much damage and was somewhat easily repaired. And so, this is where we will end our journey through the history of London, as we have now successfully learned about how London became the great city that it is today. We have discovered its roots as a patchwork of lonely farmsteads in the woods, to a small, quiet fishing port by the river. We have discussed how London suddenly grew in prosperity as a Roman town, and we have witnessed the decline during the tumultuous Saxon and Viking periods. And finally, we have learnt about how the Normans raised London up from the flames, and rebuilt it into a heavily fortified city, featuring both castles and cathedrals, with a busy central bridge allowing London citizens to travel to both sides of the Thames River with ease. Of course, this is not the end of the road for London, as it continued to flourish and expand, and even today, over 2,000 years after its birth, it continues to be one of the most influential cities in the entire world. If you have enjoyed today's documentary, I have multiple videos on various historic sites of London, some of which have been mentioned here, but I go much more in depth about their history. As such, I have created a playlist where all of my London videos can be found. But for now, thanks for watching.